The 30,000-pound bomb built to break Iran's Unbreakable nuclear mountain didn't exist for most of the last century. For years, it didn't need to. But somewhere under a mountain near a city called Qom, Iranian engineers built something they believed no weapon on Earth could reach. They were wrong. This is the story of the bomb designed to prove it. If you're enjoying this analysis, don't forget to subscribe to Cartovex Media, because the next few minutes completely change the picture. Here's the paradox at the center of this entire story. A facility can be buried under 90 meters of rock and reinforced concrete, hardened by engineers who studied exactly how enemy air forces think, and still not be safe. Not because the rock failed, because somewhere else a weapon was already being built for 15 years, waiting for the day it would be needed. That day came in June of 2025, but the story of how we got there starts somewhere else entirely, with a different country's air force, and a mission that almost got the job done, but not quite. Israel moved first. The operation was called Rising Lion, and it hit Iranian nuclear infrastructure hard, along with the scientists and engineers who kept the program running. Within days, Israel had achieved something remarkable: real functional air superiority over hostile Iranian airspace. Above-ground facilities at Natanz and Isfahan absorbed serious damage. But here's what almost nobody outside the defense community fully grasped at the time. Israel was hitting a wall it could see but couldn't punch through. That wall had a name: Fordow. A uranium enrichment plant dug into a mountain, roughly 160 kilometers south of Tehran, buried somewhere between 80 and 90 meters underground. It didn't start as a nuclear site at all, researchers say. It began life as an IRGC missile base before being converted, kept secret for years until Western intelligence exposed it publicly in 2009. And whoever designed Fordow's depth had clearly studied how Israel had struck nuclear-adjacent targets before. They buried it deep enough that conventional ordnance simply could not physically reach the enrichment halls inside. Israel does not operate a bomb heavy enough to solve that problem. In fact, nobody does, except one country. And that's exactly why, just days after Rising Lion began, a second operation was already being planned an ocean away. Rewind to June 21st into June 22nd, 2025. The United States launches Operation Midnight Hammer. According to Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, this becomes the largest operational strike in the entire history of the B-2 Spirit program. 7 of these aircraft lift off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, dead center of the continental United States, on a mission profile that keeps them airborne for more than 30 hours, round trip, all the way to Iran and back. But the 7 B-2s weren't the whole story, not even close. A separate group of B-2s flew west that same day, out over the Pacific. That detail leaked into public reporting almost immediately, and for a window of confusion, it had analysts and journalists convinced that was the strike package. It wasn't. It was a decoy. Textbook operational deception, and by every account available, it worked exactly as intended. More than 125 aircraft supported this mission in total. The strike bombers themselves, fighter escort believed to include F-22 Raptors based on Pentagon-released graphics, aerial refueling tankers, and surveillance aircraft threading together a single, coordinated act of misdirection across an entire ocean. And while all that unfolded in the air, something else was happening underwater. A U.S. Navy Ohio-class guided missile submarine launched more than 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles at a target the bombers weren't touching. 3 sites, 3 different reasons, 3 different weapons. Fordow got the weapon that justified its own existence. At approximately 6:40 p.m. Eastern Time on June 21st, 2:10 a.m. local time in Iran, the lead B-2 released the first 2 GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators onto the mountain. Over the next 25 minutes, the rest of the package followed. 12 MOPs on Fordow, 2 more on a buried section of Natanz, 14 total in a single mission, the first time this weapon had ever been used in combat, after 14 years in development. Now here's where the story slows down just long enough for you to understand exactly what dropped on that mountain, because this bomb is not a normal weapon, and treating it like one misses the entire point of the mission. The GBU-57 weighs 30,000 pounds, 15 tons of steel, explosive, and fuse, in General Kane's own words. Only the B-2 can carry it. No other aircraft in the American inventory has the payload capacity or the stealth profile required. It runs about 20 feet long, and it isn't designed to explode on contact. It's designed to survive contact. Built to punch through more than 100 feet of reinforced rock and concrete using pure kinetic force, tunneling downward before detonating at depth where the blast does maximum damage to whatever's hidden below. Picture the physics for a second. A weapon experiencing violent deceleration as it tears through solid rock, with every component of its fusing and explosive train engineered to survive that punishment and still function precisely on schedule at the bottom. That's not a simple bomb. That's 15 years of materials engineering compressed into a single irreversible moment over a mountain in Iran. But the weapon was only half the mission. The other half was getting 7 of America's rarest, most strategically sensitive aircraft into some of the most heavily defended airspace in the Middle East, undetected, the entire way in and the entire way out. According to Kane's own briefing, the U.S. is unaware of a single shot fired at the strike package on the way in. Iranian fighters never scrambled. Iranian air defense radar reportedly never acquired the formation at all. Full stealth penetration, a 30-hour combat sortie, and not one engagement. That's not a talking point. That's what stealth doctrine is supposed to achieve in the real world. And by every account we have, it worked close to perfectly here. Natanz and Isfahan tell a different story, though, because they weren't built the same way, and they weren't struck the same way.
Natanz is Iran's largest, most historically significant enrichment complex, located roughly 250 kilometers south of Tehran. It has both above-ground buildings, already battered by Israeli strikes earlier in the conflict, and deeply buried enrichment halls that needed something heavier. That's why 2 of the 14 MOPs went there. Isfahan is different again. It's a conversion facility, the site where raw yellowcake becomes uranium hexafluoride gas, the feedstock centrifuges actually need before enrichment can even begin. Isfahan's key targets sat mostly above ground, so instead of bunker busters, the strike package used more than 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles, fired from that submarine after the bombing runs on Fordow and Natanz had already wrapped up. Combined across all 3 sites, Pentagon officials put the total at roughly 75 precision-guided weapons employed in under 30 minutes of actual weapons release. Satellite imagery firms like Maxa released before and after photography within days. At Fordow, multiple large craters directly above where the underground halls sit, and wide fields of ash, dirt, and debris around ventilation shafts and access points. At Natanz, a crater consistent with 1 or 2 direct MOP strikes above the buried centrifuge cascades, plus transformers and power infrastructure not completely offline. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth told reporters the initial assessment was simple. Every munition struck exactly what it was supposed to, with what he called the desired effect. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. Because a second assessment surfaced almost immediately, and this one didn't agree. A preliminary review, reportedly from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, found that Fordow's underground structures had not fully collapsed. Worse, it suggested Iran may have already moved a significant share of its enriched uranium stockpile out of the facility before the bombs ever landed. If that read was accurate, this wasn't a knockout blow. It was a delay, measured in months, not years. The White House response was blunt. They called that assessment flat out wrong. And just like that, you had 2 competing official narratives about the exact same mission. One claiming total destruction, one warning of partial success and a missing stockpile, released within days of each other. Here's the part almost every breakdown of this operation gets wrong, because most of them were filmed in the week after the strike and never touched again. This story didn't stop developing. It kept escalating, quietly, for over a year. Independent nuclear policy researchers tracking these sites site by site using commercial satellite imagery kept publishing updated assessments for months afterward. Several months out, the consensus read was that the June 2025 strikes had likely destroyed or disabled almost all of Iran's roughly 22,000 installed centrifuges across its 3 safeguarded sites, while also crippling Iran's ability to manufacture replacement centrifuges or produce fresh uranium hexafluoride feedstock. For the first time in about 20 years, researchers assessed Iran had no clear path to weapons-grade uranium through its existing centrifuge infrastructure. On paper, that's a massive strategic outcome. But the stockpile was the catch the entire time. Before the strikes, Iran had accumulated roughly 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%, well beyond civilian reactor needs, sitting right at the doorstep of the 90% threshold that defines weapons-grade material. Then Vice President J.D. Vance said publicly, in the days after the strike, that Iran likely still possessed that stockpile. Nobody could say exactly where. Buried under Fordow's rubble, moved into tunnels at Isfahan, split across multiple locations, possibly including an unstruck, still under construction site nicknamed Pickaxe Mountain near Natanz. And then the story escalated again because this was never a single event operation, no matter how the first 48 hours of coverage made it feel. Between February and April of 2026, a second round of conflict erupted. Additional American and Israeli strikes hit Iranian nuclear-adjacent facilities, including a site called Talegan 2, along with renewed strikes at Natanz. Reporting and satellite imagery indicated massive ordnance penetrators were used again, this time against newly hardened targets, sites reinforced with fresh concrete shells and buried under additional soil, specifically anticipating another round of attacks. Read that carefully. Iran wasn't caught off guard the second time. Iran had spent the months in between actively preparing for exactly this. Then, on February 28, 2026, Iran made a decision that reshaped the entire story again. It terminated all IAEA access to its nuclear sites. Surveillance cameras disabled, seals removed from declared facilities. By every account available, this is the most serious verification blackout the IAEA has experienced with Iran since it began monitoring the program in the first place. As of the most recent IAEA reporting, Iran is holding approximately 440.9 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, not less than before the strikes, more. Enough, if further enriched, for roughly 10 nuclear devices. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi has said this material is likely held somewhere across Isfahan, Natanz, and Fordow. But with inspectors locked out, none of it can currently be independently verified by anyone outside Iran. So where does that leave the damage assessment today, more than a year later?
Open source analysts currently estimate Natanz's main enrichment plant at roughly 75% damaged, with more than 6,000 first-generation centrifuges destroyed, and its research wing assessed near 95% destroyed. Isfahan's conversion facility sits around 90% destroyed, and Fordow, the entire reason the GBU-57 was built in the first place, is assessed by some analysts at only around 30% damaged. The core facility may still be substantially intact, buried under enough displaced rock that nobody outside Iran can get a clean read on its true condition. That is a very different picture than completely obliterated. It's also a very different picture than nothing happened. It sits in a disputed, murky middle, and anyone claiming total certainty about Fordow's condition a year later is overselling their confidence.
Naturally, theories fill the vacuum. One claimed Iran had advance warning and evacuated everything before the strike, making the whole mission symbolic. The real evidence is messier. Satellite imagery did show truck convoys near Fordow's tunnel entrances beforehand, but analysts read that two completely different ways. Material moving out ahead of an anticipated strike, or equipment moving further in, because Iran still believed the mountain would protect it. Both readings remain live in the open source record.
Another theory claimed Iranian air defenses put up serious resistance and it was covered up. Pentagon's own on-record briefing points the opposite direction. 0 shots fired, no scramble, no radar acquisition. A third theory assumed the story ended in June 2025. It didn't. The February-April 2026 round and the IAEA blackout arguably matter more than the original strike itself. And a fourth theory conflates centrifuges destroyed with Iran's nuclear ambitions are over. Independent researchers are careful to separate those two things. Destroying infrastructure is not the same as eliminating institutional knowledge, trained scientists, or a demonstrated willingness to keep building at alternate sites like Pickaxe Mountain the entire time. None of this happens without one specific aircraft, and it's worth understanding why. The B-2 Spirit has been in service since the 1990s, originally conceived as a Cold War answer to the densest air defense networks on the planet. It's a flying wing, no traditional fuselage, no vertical tail, a shape engineered almost entirely around minimizing radar cross-section, the amount of signal it bounces back to a ground station hunting for it. Combine that shape with radar-absorbent coatings and fully internal weapons carriage, and you get an aircraft that can cross into contested airspace looking, to enemy radar, like something far smaller than a multi-100,000-pound bomber. Only 21 of these aircraft were ever built. All of them fly out of Whiteman Air Force Base. Every single time one is committed to a real combat mission rather than a training exercise, that decision runs through the absolute highest levels of the chain of command, because you are risking a genuinely irreplaceable strategic asset on a single roll of the dice. And the human side of that mission deserves its own moment. A B-2 crew is 2 people, pilot and mission commander, managing more than 30 hours of continuous system monitoring, fatigue, and multiple nighttime aerial refuelings, one of the most demanding tasks in all of aviation, even without a war zone attached to it. No maneuvering, no dogfighting instincts to lean on, just precision, patience, and total trust in stealth doctrine holding for the entire round trip. Based on everything reported, no shots fired, no scramble, no radar acquisition, this comes about as close to a textbook stealth penetration as modern combat aviation gets. Politically, the aftershock split almost exactly along existing alliance lines. Domestically, it triggered real debate in Congress over war powers and whether consultation should have happened before a strike this size. Internationally, allies who had already backed Israel's campaign framed the American strike as a necessary final piece to prevent a hardened, still active enrichment site from surviving the broader effort. Other governments and international bodies raised concerns about the precedent of striking nuclear-related infrastructure directly, and about the risks of bombing sites that store enriched material. The IAEA itself has stayed carefully restrained, sticking to what it can verify rather than weighing in on strategic wisdom, which makes sense given its mandate is monitoring, not policy. But the fallout wasn't only military, and it wasn't only diplomatic. It was economic too, and this is the part that rarely makes it into a strike package breakdown. In the hours after the first reports of American involvement broke, oil markets moved fast. Traders immediately started pricing in the one scenario every energy desk fears most out of this region: a disruption at the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply physically passes every single day. Crude futures spiked on the uncertainty alone, before a single tanker had actually been touched. Shipping insurers reportedly began quietly adjusting premiums for vessels transiting the Gulf.
None of that required an actual blockade to happen. The mere possibility was enough to move global energy markets within hours, which tells you something important about how tightly this single strategic strait is wound into the world economy. It didn't stop at oil. Defense sector stocks in the United States saw notable movement in the days following the strike, as markets tried to price in what a prolonged confrontation with Iran might mean for future defense spending. Currency markets in the region wobbled, and gold, the classic safe haven asset investors reach for when geopolitical uncertainty spikes, ticked upward as well. None of this made headlines the way the strike itself did, but military operations like this one don't stay contained to a mountain in Iran. They ripple through shipping lanes, energy contracts, and trading floors thousands of miles away within hours. And the great powers who weren't directly involved were watching just as closely as the markets were. Russia and China both issued statements condemning the American and Israeli strikes as violations of sovereignty and international law, though neither moved militarily to intervene. For Moscow, already deep into its own prolonged conflict in Ukraine, the optics mattered more than any direct response, a chance to frame Washington as the aggressor on the world stage. For Beijing, which depends heavily on energy imports transiting the Gulf and has deepening economic ties with Tehran, the strikes represented a direct threat to supply chains it has spent years trying to insulate. Neither Moscow nor Beijing has the desire, or arguably the capability, to intervene militarily on Iran's behalf. But both use the moment diplomatically, positioning themselves as the responsible alternative to a Western security order they've spent years arguing is destabilizing. That's not a side note. That's the global power balance actually shifting in real time, one diplomatic statement at a time, while the world's attention stayed fixed on bombers and bunkers. So here's the real question at the center of all of it, more than a year on. Not did the mission succeed, because by any technical measure, the execution was close to flawless. Complete stealth, precision weapons on every hardened target, every aircraft and crew home safe. The real question is whether an airstrike, however perfectly executed, was ever capable of solving the actual problem underneath it. You can destroy 22,000 centrifuges with the right bomb dropped in exactly the right place. That part, the evidence increasingly supports. What's much harder, maybe impossible, is guaranteeing you've destroyed or even located several hundred kilograms of material that a determined state has had more than a year to move, hide, and protect behind a verification blackout of its own making. That's the uncomfortable, unresolved center of this entire story. Operation Midnight Hammer set Iran's centrifuge and enrichment infrastructure back, likely by years. It did not eliminate the stockpile, the scientists, the institutional knowledge, or the intent. Physical infrastructure and strategic intent are two different problems, and this operation only ever had the tools to solve one of them. But here's the detail that should worry planners more than anything else in this entire story, and it's the one almost nobody talks about. Iran didn't just absorb the strike and go quiet, it studied it. The reinforced concrete shells and buried soil layers discovered ahead of the February-April 2026 round weren't reactive, they were anticipatory. Engineering decisions made by people who had already watched the GBU-57 defeat their previous best defense and were actively designing the next version of that defense before the first round of dust had even settled. That's the pattern that should concern anyone thinking about the next decade of this standoff, not just the last one. Every hardened facility that survives a strike becomes a design brief for the next one, and every weapon that defeats a hardened facility becomes the baseline the next design has to beat. This is not a story with a finish line. It's an arms race measured in meters of reinforced concrete on one side and tons of penetrating steel on the other, and neither side has any incentive to stop building. That single dynamic is also why this operation matters far beyond Iran itself. Every other state on Earth that is currently building or considering a hardened, deeply buried strategic facility for a weapons program, for command infrastructure, for anything it wants protected from an adversary's air force, just watched a live demonstration of exactly what 30,000 pounds of precisely engineered steel can do to 90 meters of solid rock, delivered by an aircraft nobody saw coming. That lesson doesn't stay contained to Tehran. It gets studied in defense ministries from Pyongyang to Moscow to Beijing, because deterrence doesn't just work on the country it was aimed at. It works, or fails to work, in the minds of everyone else watching from a distance, quietly running the same calculation about their own hardened facilities and whether they'd survive the same knock on the door. 14 bunker busters, 75 precision weapons, 3 nuclear sites, a 30-hour non-stop flight from the middle of Missouri to a mountain in Iran and back, without a single shot fired at the formation either way. And more than a year later, the IAEA still can't tell you where several hundred kilograms of enriched uranium actually are. That's not the ending most coverage gave you in the first 48 hours. It's the ending the evidence actually supports, and it's still being written.